I didn't die saving anyone. Nobody pulled me from a burning building, and nobody will ever put my name on a plaque. I died because I refused to log off. My name was Daniel Pierce, 29 years old, senior actuarial analyst by day, and, by night, Frostbite, the second-ranked strategist on the North American server of Eternal Rift. For 6 years, I had told myself that quitting my job to play video games full-time would be irresponsible. So instead, I did both jobs at once, which is how, on a perfectly ordinary Thursday, I ended up staring at a wall of numbers at 4:47 a.m., insisting to my empty apartment that I only needed one more pull to finally down the raid boss my guild had wiped on for 3 straight weeks. We got him. Voidmaw, the 8-armed mare that had haunted my dreams and destroyed my sleep schedule, finally dropped dead in a shower of purple loot. I remember screaming so loud my neighbor banged on the wall. I remember my heart doing something strange and fluttery in my chest, like a hard drive grinding on its last few sectors. I remember thinking, with the calm, stupid clarity of a man who has clearly made several bad decisions, that's new, right before the world went dark. Turns out, that's new was my heart giving out from caffeine, no sleep, and the kind of stress that doesn't show up on a resume. 29 years old, and I went out mid-victory screen. If there's a hall of fame for pathetic deaths, I'd like to nominate myself. The next thing I knew, I was standing on the bank of a very wide, very quiet river, watching translucent figures shuffle toward a light in the distance, like the world's most depressing check-in line. Somewhere in my English major brain, a memory clicked. Oh, this is a Psychopomp river. I've seen this exact loading screen in at least 4 different games. I did not get to walk across it because a hole tore open in the air in front of me, black, silent, and rude, and yanked me in like I was nothing more than a dropped call. Static, screaming, mine. And then a soft blue light, and an apology scrolling in front of my eyes like the world's worst customer service chat. To the soul affected by the recent incident, our sincerest apologies. Your soul was accidentally caught in dimensional interference and sustained damage during retrieval. Standard reincarnation is not currently safe for you. We are relocating your consciousness into a stable, compatible host body in a parallel world so that your soul may heal naturally over time. Please do not attempt to end this new life prematurely. Doing so may cause irreversible dissolution. Cool. Cool. So I'm too broken to be reborn properly, and the backup plan is body snatching. Got it. The host body belongs to Julian Calloway of a world in which your world's fiction, the novel Crown of Thorns, is in fact lived history. The events of that novel are only one possible outcome for that world, not a fixed script. You will retain your memories. The host's memories will surface gradually. Crown of Thorns. The name landed in my stomach like a dropped weight, because I knew exactly what that was. My college roommate, Steph, used to read it on her Kindle at 2 a.m. and narrate the plot at me whether I wanted to hear it or not. Some overwrought alpha and omega political drama about a war hero and the senator's daughter he was arranged to marry, and the deranged omega heir who tries to destroy their romance out of spite and ends up disgraced, drug-addicted, and dead in a gutter by the final act. She had shown me fan art of the villain once. You'd actually be kind of hot as him, she'd said, squinting at her screen. Same jaw. Tragic backstory. Terrible decisions. Terrific. I died playing video games and got reincarnated as my ex-roommate's book, Boyfriend's Punching Bag. That is all we are permitted to share. Live well. Live long. We will not be contacting you again. The light vanished. I woke up gasping, lungs burning, and the first thing I registered wasn't panic, it was the smell. Cedar and clean linen and money, the specific expensive nothing scent of a house where somebody's job is to make sure nothing smells like anything. I opened my eyes to a ceiling so far away it needed its own zip code, and an honest-to-God crystal chandelier catching the morning light like it was auditioning for a role. Okay, I said out loud, to nobody. My voice came out lighter than I expected, younger. The gods weren't lying about the upgrade. If you're the type who likes a story that starts with a death and somehow only gets funnier from there, go ahead and hit follow now, because this is about to get a lot messier, and I promise it's worth sticking around for. Nye. I found a mirror before I found a mirror, if that makes sense. I found my reflection in the black screen of a wall-mounted television first, and nearly walked into a bookshelf trying to get a better look. The actual mirror, gold-framed and enormous, confirmed it. Same general bone structure I'd always had, somehow but sharper, like someone had taken my face and run it through a very expensive filter. dark eyes, and hair the color of a Labrador that had never had a bad day in its life. "I'm blonde," I said, touching it like it might not be real. "I'm an actual blonde man now." Fragments started arriving after that, the way the voice had promised. Not full memories, just flashes, like scrolling through someone else's camera roll at high speed. A stern man with silver at his temples, cold as a Chicago winter, Robert Calloway. A woman with kind, tired eyes who flinched every time I entered a room, Diane. An older brother built like a recruiting poster, golden and effortless, David. A younger sister who filmed everything for her page, Charlotte. And underneath all of it, a persistent, ugly hum. A boy standing at the edges of family photos, drifting further out of frame every year, until one Christmas he wasn't in the photo at all. I inherited a body, a bank account, and a reputation that read like a highlight reel of bad choices. Perfect. A knock came, deep and disapproving even through solid wood. "Master Julian, your father requests your presence at lunch." "It is not a request this time." I froze. Robert Calloway. In the story, in my memory of Steph's plot summaries, this was the man who eventually disowned his adopted Omega son on live television for embarrassing the family name. I got dressed in the first clean shirt I found, and went down like a level 1 character wandering into a boss room by accident. The dining room had the kind of silence you could serve on a plate. 5 people sat at a marble table long enough to land a small aircraft on. Robert at the head, reading something on a tablet without looking up. Diane beside him, poking at a salad she clearly wasn't going to eat. David and Charlotte across from an empty seat that was apparently mine. "You're late," Robert said, not looking up. "I assumed the club was more interesting than your own family." Old Julian, I was fairly sure, would have said something about how the club was in fact more interesting than this family. I was too tired, and frankly too hungry, for that particular strain of chaos. Being a professional disappointment sounded exhausting, and if there was one thing my previous life had taught me, it was that exhausting hobbies needed a very good reason to be worth the effort. Petty family warfare did not make the cut. "Sorry," I said. "Lost track of time. Won't happen again." A fork clattered. I think it was Charlotte's. David actually looked up from his coffee, one eyebrow raised like I'd started speaking in tongues. "You're apologizing?" Robert lowered the tablet an inch, gray eyes narrowing like he suspected a trap. "Without demanding I raise your allowance in exchange?" "I'm just hungry, Dad." I sat and reached for what turned out to be some kind of extremely fancy sea bass. It was, objectively, the best thing I had ever put in my mouth, and considering my previous diet had been ramen and desperation, that wasn't a high bar, but still. "This is incredible, by the way. Is this what food tastes like when you're not poor?" David leaned forward, studying me like a crime scene. "Who are you, and what did you do with my brother?" "Did you finally get arrested, and this is the good behavior act for the judge?" "I'm just trying to eat, David." The rest of lunch went like that. Me, quietly demolishing a fish, while 4 people who clearly loved and dreaded this stranger in equal measure tried to figure out what fresh disaster my silence was hiding. Nobody accused me of anything. Nobody threw anything. When I said I had some studying to do and excused myself, Robert actually laughed, short and disbelieving, and Charlotte whispered something to David that included the word apocalypse. I made it back to my room, locked the door, and allowed myself exactly one full-body groan of relief. "Okay, Julian Calloway," I told the empty room. "Let's see if this place has Wi-Fi worth dying twice for." It did. Behind a hidden panel was a gaming setup that made my old rig look like a calculator with delusions of grandeur. Triple curved monitors, a chair that had probably cost more than my old car, the whole 9 yards. I sat down, and for the first time since waking up in a stranger's mansion, something in my chest finally unclenched. Then I made the mistake of Googling my own name. Calloway heir escorted from downtown club after altercation. 3rd incident this quarter. Sources say Julian Calloway has been quietly using suppressants recreationally. Insiders worry about his health. A photo from years back, a boy of maybe 11 with 2 wide eyes, captioned, "Calloway family formally announces the adoption of Julian, a bright young Omega from the Ridgewood Outreach Center, a sponsorship kid turned publicity project turned family disappointment." Somewhere around junior year of high school, according to the old photo albums, he'd started drifting to the edges of every group picture until he vanished from them completely. Nobody in this house had told me why. And apparently nobody was going to. "Fine," I muttered, closing the tab. "New plan. I don't need the backstory to know the strategy. Stay in the room, don't interact with anyone, don't trigger any death flags. I did not get resurrected to be the tragic villain of anybody's fan fiction. I'm going to be the guy who quietly plays video games in the West Wing until his soul is done recovering. That's the whole plan. It's a great plan. It requires zero effort, which is my favorite kind. It was, I'd later admit, an extremely bad plan. It lasted about 6 hours, because that evening Diane knocked on my door herself, and her voice had a note in it I hadn't heard yet. Not disappointed, not suspicious. Hopeful, and scared to be. Julian, sweetheart. There's the Ridgewood Center Gala tonight. The one we sponsor, the one you were adopted through. Your father is chairing it this year, and appearances have already gone out with your name on the guest list. I know things have been strained, but it would mean a great deal if you came, just for an hour. I stared at the door for a long moment. The old Julian's memory supplied a flash of the same event from a previous year, standing at the edge of a ballroom in a suit that didn't fit right, watching his family shake hands with donors, feeling like a museum exhibit labeled before. This is a death flag, my brain informed me helpfully, in the exact tone of a game warning me I was about to enter a PvP zone unequipped. Public event. Family reputation on the line. High risk of scandal. But it was also, according to every fragment of memory I had, the one event this family actually cared about him attending. The one place his name meant something other than problem. I'll be down in 20, I said, and heard Diane's soft, startled exhale through the door before her footsteps retreated. I put on the least club-adjacent suit I could find, looked at myself in the gold mirror. Blonde, sharp-jawed, 24 years old, and about to walk into a room full of people who'd already decided who he was, and said, mostly to convince myself, level 1 character. Full raid gear. Let's not die. System alerts. I know I don't have a system, this is just what my brain does now, apparently. New lation detected. The Windward Room, downtown Chicago. Danger level. Unclear, but the string quartet seems judgmental. The ballroom was the kind of gorgeous that made you nervous. All soaring windows looking out over Lake Michigan at dusk. Waiters gliding around with trays of something that was definitely not a normal appetizer. A room full of people who all seemed to already know each other's net worth. I lasted about 4 minutes of small talk before my new Omega nervous system, a whole biological category I was still getting used to having, decided this was the perfect moment to have opinions. It started as a prickle at the back of my neck. Then my hands went cold, and the noise of the room narrowed down to a high, thin ring, like my body had decided, with zero input from me, that this was an excellent time to short-circuit. I'd later learn this had a name. Scent instability. The kind of thing that happened to Omegas under acute stress, especially ones whose biology had just been forcibly relocated into a body it hadn't grown up in. At the time, all I knew was that the walls were doing something walls shouldn't do, and I needed out, immediately, before I did something humiliating in front of 300 of Chicago's finest. I found a side hallway, dim and blessedly empty, and put both hands against the cool marble wall like it could hold me together through sheer structural integrity. Okay, I whispered. Okay, we are not passing out at a charity gala. That's a whole new tier of humiliating. You're not going to pass out, said a voice behind me, low and completely calm, like he dealt with strangers hyperventilating in hallways on a regular basis. But you should probably breathe before you try to convince yourself of that. I turned around too fast, which did not help the room-spinning situation, and found myself looking up, which was new. I wasn't used to being the shorter one in any equation, at a man who looked like he'd been carved out of the same marble as the wall I was leaning on. Character sheet rendered. Apparently that's a thing my brain does now too. Name unknown, but let's be honest, look at him build. Person who has personally carried another human being out of a burning vehicle, possibly more than once vibe. Extremely, unfairly calm threat assessment. Catastrophic, in several different directions. He was in dress uniform, dark green with more ribbons than I could count, standing with the kind of stillness that felt less like relaxation and more like a coiled spring that had decided, for now, not to go off. Short dark hair, a jaw you could cut glass on, and eyes the gray-green of storm water, currently fixed on me with an intensity that had nothing to do with politeness and everything to do with the fact that, I would realize later, far too late to be useful, an alpha standing this close to a distressed, unbonded Omega was not a small thing. Breathe, he said again, quieter. He didn't touch me. He just planted himself a careful, deliberate 2 feet away, close enough that I could feel the warmth coming off him, far enough that it wasn't a threat. Something about the sheer steadiness of it, like he had all night, like there was nowhere else in the world he needed to be, cut straight through the ringing in my ears. In for 4. Hold for 4. You're not in danger. You're just overloaded. I don't know if it was the alpha thing, the low-level cadence of his voice, doing exactly what alpha voices apparently did to panicking omegas, or if it was just that nobody had spoken to me that gently since I'd woken up in this body. But my breathing actually followed his count. In, hold, out, until the ringing faded and the hallway stopped tilting. There, he said, and something in his shoulders eased too, like he'd been more braced than he let on. Better? Define better, I said, which came out a lot more like my actual personality than anything I'd said all day. I just had a full nervous system meltdown in front of a guy who looks like a recruitment poster. I've had better nights. The corner of his mouth did something. Not quite a smile, more like the ghost of one passing through, gone almost before I caught it. You handled it well. Most people panic worse. That's a low bar, considering the alternative was face-planting into the hors d'oeuvres. That got an actual sound out of him, short, surprised, almost a laugh, quickly smothered like he wasn't sure he was allowed to make it. He was looking at me the way you'd look at something you hadn't expected to find in this particular hallway, at this particular gala, and for one strange suspended second, neither of us said anything at all. Then a woman's voice cut down the corridor, clipped, urgent, unmistakably looking for him. Major Hartley? Major, they need you for photos. Something in me went very still. Hartley. The name landed like a piece clicking into a slot I hadn't known was in me until it filled. Somewhere in the wreckage of Julian's memory and Steph's 2 a.m. Plot summaries, a headline surfaced. William Hartley, the hero of Ridge and Pass. Alpha heir to Hartley Industries. The man Crown of Thorns had arranged to marry a senator's daughter, and the man its disgraced villain spent half a book obsessed with, for reasons the book never bothered to make sympathetic. I was standing in a dim hallway, having just been personally talked down from a panic spiral by the actual male lead of the actual novel I was supposedly the villain of. "You're the Major," I said, a little faintly. You're that Hartley." Something flickered behind his eyes. Wariness, maybe, the specific tired wariness of a man who was used to that exact tone of voice, the one people used right before they either wanted something from him or started performing for him. "I am," he said carefully. "And you're Julian Calloway." He said my name like it weighed something, like he already knew the headlines the same way I now knew his. "In the flesh," I said. "Sorry in advance for whatever you've heard." "I don't put much stock in what I hear," he said, and there was something in the way he said it, quiet, deliberate, looking at me and not through me, that landed somewhere under my ribs and stayed there. "I put stock in what I see." The woman's voice called for him again, closer this time. He held my gaze one beat longer than the moment strictly required, like he was memorizing something, and then he inclined his head, courteous and formal, every inch the war hero the tabloids loved. Julian, just my name low, like he was testing the shape of it in his mouth. "I hope the rest of your evening is less eventful." Then he was gone, back into the light and noise of the ballroom, and I was left standing in the hallway with my heart doing something that had nothing to do with panic anymore, and absolutely everything to do with the fact that a man built like a recruiting poster had just called down my entire racing pulse with nothing but a countdown and a low voice, and I had, apparently, liked it. "Oh no," I said out loud, to the empty hallway. "Oh no. This is a death flag with a jawline." I spent the rest of the gala doing my best impression of a piece of furniture, and it worked right up until the drive home, when Diane turned around in the passenger seat with an expression I did not like at all. "You were talking to Major Hartley," she said, "not a question." Briefly, I had a moment and he was there. "It wasn't a whole thing, Julian." My father's voice from the driver's seat, and I braced for the ice, except when he glanced at me in the rearview mirror, there wasn't any. Just something appraising. Careful. William Hartley does not make small talk at galas. He gave a toast, and left within the hour every year prior to this one. Great, I get to be the reason a war hero broke his personal record for shortest gala attendance. That's not concerning at all. But that night, lying in a bed that still felt too big and too foreign, I found myself replaying it anyway. The careful 2 feet of space, the count of 4, the way he'd said, "I put stock in what I see," like it was a promise instead of a line. In my old life, I would have logged that whole encounter as a rare spawn event, screenshot it, and moved on with my day. Instead, I lay there running it back like a highlight reel, and somewhere underneath the part of my brain still cataloging death flags and danger levels, another, quieter part of me was thinking, I wouldn't mind that happening again. This is a problem, I told my ceiling. The ceiling, unhelpfully, did not disagree. The next evening, I came downstairs looking for leftovers and walked straight into the first family dinner I'd voluntarily attended since waking up in this body. The dining room door was open, a small thing, but I'd learned by now that an open door in the Calloway house meant something. Usually it meant keep walking, this isn't for you. I'd internalized that particular rule so thoroughly that my feet were already turning toward the stairs on autopilot before Diane looked up and caught me in the doorway. Julian, not sharp, inviting, in a way that still felt unfamiliar on her, like a language she was relearning. We were just talking about the gala photos. Sit, have you eaten? I looked at the stairs. Old habit, old script. NPCs don't get invited to the family table. It's not in the plot. Then I looked at the empty chair between David and Charlotte and thought about the version of this story where nobody had ever asked me that question at all, where a boy drifted out of the family photos one Christmas, and nobody noticed until it was too late to matter. I could eat, I said. Nobody made a big production out of it, which somehow made it land harder. Alfred simply materialized from wherever butlers materialize from, laid an extra setting between David and Charlotte like he'd been waiting for exactly this moment, and refilled my water glass without a word. So, Charlotte said, unable to help herself for more than 90 seconds, is it true you threatened a Hartley board member with blackmail at a shareholder dinner, or is that just what Instagram is saying? It's true, I said, reaching for the bread. Mostly true. 80% true. The remaining 20% was an extremely convincing bluff. You bluffed a corporate board member, David said, delighted, with information you didn't have. I had some information. I just didn't have documentation. There's a difference, and it's called improvisation. Robert, at the head of the table, didn't look up from his plate, but as I reached for the butter, he slid the dish 2 inches closer without a word, the exact distance that put it comfortably in my reach, instead of across the table where it had been. It was such a small thing. A level 1 interaction, if I were still keeping score in game terms. But in a house that had spent years treating me like an unexploded device, it felt enormous. Since when? Diane asked, watching the whole exchange with an expression that was trying very hard not to be openly emotional and mostly failing. Do you talk to your father like this? Like it's normal? I don't know, I said honestly, around a mouthful of the best bread I'd ever eaten in either of my lives. It's been kind of growing on me. The whole talking. Eating dinner where nobody's plotting anything. Radical stuff. We were never plotting anything, Robert said, gruff, still not looking up, though the corner of his mouth had gone suspiciously soft, like it hadn't quite decided yet whether it was allowed to. I know, I said, and found, a little startled, that I meant it. I sat at that table until dessert, arguing with Charlotte about whether her latest role required a dialect coach or just better instincts, listening to David complain about quarterly projections in a tone that suggested he found it more entertaining than he'd admit, watching my mother laugh, a real laugh, unguarded, for the first time since I'd moved into this body. Somewhere in the middle of it, without noticing exactly when it happened, I stopped bracing for the other shoe to drop. The walls of the Calloway house had stopped feeling like a waiting room for disaster. I still wasn't ready to call it home out loud, but for the first time in 2 lives, sitting there with crumbs on my plate and my sister's laughter ringing in my ears, I caught myself hoping I wouldn't have to leave it. He did it again 3 days later, which I would come to learn was very much a Hartley Industries specialty, showing up exactly when you'd convinced yourself he wouldn't. I was at Ridgewood Center, the outreach program that had funneled Julian into the Calloway family in the first place, and where old memory fragments told me he used to volunteer before everything fell apart, helping a very small, very determined kid named Marcus beat the final boss of a game 2 console generations too old for him to be playing, when a shadow fell over the couch and every kid in the rec room sat up ramrod straight like someone had flipped a switch. Major Hartley, Marcus abandoned the controller mid-fight to launch himself at William's legs, which, a 200-pound war hero absorbing a flying 7-year-old without so much as swaying, was objectively one of the funniest and most alarming things I'd seen all week. Character sheet, update new data acquired. This man does volunteer shifts at a kids' outreach center. Threat level revised from catastrophic to catastrophic, and also apparently good with children, which is somehow worse. I didn't know you knew this place, I said. Once Marcus had been peeled off him and reinstalled on the couch, aggressively unpaused and losing badly. I've been coming here since I was 17. William settled onto the arm of the couch like it was the most natural thing in the world, and did not, I noticed, sit any closer than the gala hallway had been. Careful, deliberate, like he was still keeping count of the space between us on purpose. I didn't know you did too, used to. Before, I gestured vaguely at myself, at the whole disaster of Julian Calloway's public record. Before I became a professional embarrassment, something tightened around his eyes, not judgment. Something closer to anger aimed somewhere that wasn't me. The tabloids don't run corrections when they're wrong, only when they're sued. You say that like you have personal experience. I have several years of it. A pause, and then, quieter, in a tone I was starting to recognize as the one he used when he'd decided to say something true instead of something easy. You handed Marcus that controller and let him win 3 rounds before you started actually trying. I noticed. That's not a secret. Half of Chicago's read the headlines about how I supposedly can't be trusted around minors. I don't read headlines, William said simply. I watch what people do when they think no one's paying attention to the details. You were paying attention to a 7-year-old's ego over a video game. That tells me more than 3 years of gossip columns. I did not have a witty response for that. For possibly the first time since I'd woken up in this body, I did not have a single joke loaded and ready to deploy, and I sat there on a beat-up couch in a community center rec room, feeling my whole face heat up while a decorated war hero looked at me like I was worth paying attention to. You're staring, I finally managed. I'm aware, he said, and did not stop. That became the pattern over the next few weeks. Not dramatic, not the kind of thing that would make a good highlight reel, just a slow accumulation of small, deliberate collisions. He'd be at Ridgewood on the same afternoons I volunteered, which was either an enormous coincidence or the least subtle thing a decorated military strategist had ever attempted. He started appearing at family events my parents dragged me to, standing near enough that I always knew exactly where he was in a room without having to look. Once, after Diane mentioned offhand that I'd been living on gas station coffee and vending machine dinners during finals week at the university my father had bought my way into, an obscenely expensive meal delivery service started showing up at my dorm door every single evening for 2 weeks straight, no note, no name on the order, until I finally cornered him about it, and he had the audacity to look almost sheepish. You were eating like a war criminal, he said, by way of explanation. I have resources. I used them. That's not an answer, that's a confession. Then consider it a confession. I made him replace the standing order with actual groceries after that, mostly because I could not, in good conscience, let a man who had once single-handedly held a mountain pass continue to subsidize my microwave burrito habit. But I kept the little card that came with the last delivery, the one where, underneath the delivery instructions, in handwriting far neater than I expected, from someone who apparently threw grenades for a living, he'd written, "Eat something that isn't beige." It sat on my desk for a week before I admitted to myself that I'd kept it on purpose. Somewhere around then, lying face down on my absurdly expensive mattress after yet another coincidental run-in, it occurred to me that I had officially become the least lazy version of myself in either lifetime, and that this was, statistically, a red flag. I had ambushed a board member. I had memorized a 7-year-old's entire chess-opening repertoire out of pure competitive spite. I had at one point considered, briefly shamefully, reading an actual book about corporate finance so I'd understand what Kane was up to faster. This was not the low-effort villain retirement plan I had signed up for. This is what the title's about, I informed my ceiling, with the weary clarity of a man realizing he'd been narrating the wrong half of his own story. Everyone keeps asking why the hero's so obsessed. Nobody's asking why the laziest man in 2 lifetimes just voluntarily got up early 2 days in a row. The ceiling, once again, declined to comment. Character sheet rendered name. Sophie Larkspur age, 26 role. Senator's daughter, socially engineered fiancé-in-waiting to William Hartley threat level, surprisingly low, possible ally, recommend not panicking. I met her at a fundraiser I'd been strong-armed into by my father, 3 days after William had rearranged his entire schedule, apparently, to be my +1, a fact that had already made the society pages under a headline I refused to read out loud. Sophie found me by the bar, elegant in the specific armor-plated way of women who'd grown up performing poise, and I braced for hostility that never came. "You can relax," she said, amused, watching me watch the door for William like a soldier watching for artillery. "I'm not going to fight you for him. I never wanted this arrangement any more than he did. Our fathers wanted it. I want to go to law school and never speak to either of them again." That's extremely reasonable, actually. I am an extremely reasonable person being forced to star in a very unreasonable engagement announcement I never agreed to. She sipped her champagne, studying me with something that felt less like appraisal and more like relief. "He's been different since you showed up, you know. Lighter. William Hartley does not linger at parties. He arrives, does the diplomacy, and leaves within the hour, every time, for 3 years running. Now he lingers." "He's probably just supervising a national security threat," I said. "I've caused 3 minor scandals this year." "He's not supervising anything." Sophie's smile went a little wry, a little kind. "He watches the door until you walk through it, and then he stops watching the door." I'd know. I've been watching him do it at every single event we've both attended for the last month. I opened my mouth for a comeback, and found, for once, that I didn't actually want one. It's hard to be glib about a man watching a door for you. So instead I just stood there next to a woman who should have hated me on principle, holding a glass of champagne I wasn't going to drink, feeling something unfamiliar and warm settle in my chest where the sarcasm usually lived. It took exactly 1 gallery opening for me to discover that William Hartley, hero of Ridgeline Pass, decorated strategist, terrifyingly calm under literal enemy fire, turned into something else entirely when another alpha got too friendly at a party. His name was Preston Ashby something, old Chicago money, the kind of jaw that looked like it had been focus grouped, and he cornered me by the wine table with the specific oblivious confidence of a man who had never once in his life been told no. "Julian Calloway," he said, like my name was a personal accomplishment of his. "I have to say, the rumors did not do you justice. Dinner sometime? I know a place that doesn't let just anyone in." "I'm sure it's very exclusive," I said, already scanning the room for an exit. "But I'm actually—" "Taken," said a voice behind me, low and pleasant, and absolutely radiating the vibe of a man who had just located a threat on a battlefield, and was calmly requesting permission to engage it. William didn't raise his voice. He didn't do anything dramatic at all, just appeared at my shoulder with 2 glasses of sparkling water, handed me one, and looked at Preston with an expression of such polite, immovable finality that the other man actually took a physical step back, like he'd walked face first into a wall he hadn't noticed was there. "Major Hartley," Preston said, considerably less confident than 4 seconds prior. "I didn't realize." "Now you do," William said, still pleasant, still not raising his voice even slightly, and somehow that was so much worse for Preston than if he had. "Enjoy the gallery." Preston left. Quickly. I watched him go with an expression I was almost certain looked far too delighted for someone who was supposed to be annoyed on principle. "You didn't have to do that," I said, once we were alone by the wine table. "I had it handled." "I know you did." William's jaw was doing a thing, tight, controlled, the specific stillness of a man exercising enormous discipline over something that badly wanted to be less disciplined. "I wanted to do it anyway. That's very alpha of you. I'm aware." A beat. Was it too much? I considered lying, just to see him worry about it a little longer, purely for scientific and entertainment purposes. Then I looked at him, jaw still tight, shoulders still a fraction too stiff, eyes doing a slow, careful check of the room that had absolutely nothing to do with security detail, and everything to do with making sure Preston Ashby something had actually left the building, and found I couldn't quite manage it. It was extremely satisfying to watch, I admitted, 10 out of 10. Would cause a scene at a gallery opening again. Something in his shoulders finally eased. "Good." "You're allowed to be jealous, you know," I said, watching him carefully. "You don't have to pretend it's a security concern." "I wasn't pretending it was a security concern, William." "Fine." He exhaled, and something in his face went unguarded in a way I was starting to recognize as a rare, deliberate gift, not an accident. I don't like watching other alphas talk to you like you're something to be acquired. I know you can handle yourself. I've watched you dismantle a corrupt board member with nothing but nerve and a bluff. It isn't about whether you need protecting. His hand found mine, careful, deliberate thumb tracing once across my knuckles, like he still hadn't gotten used to being allowed to do that. It's that I don't want to share the doorway I've been watching for a month now. Is that an acceptable answer? That, I said, a little unsteadily, is an extremely acceptable answer. The closest thing my new life had to a villain, and believe me, the irony of that was not lost on a man who was, canonically, supposed to be the villain himself, turned out to be a Hartley Industries board member named Victor Kane, a lean, sharp-suited executive who'd spent years angling to install his own preferred candidate as the company's heir apparent, and who saw William's very public interest in a disgraced Omega socialite as either a scandal to weaponize or a wedge to exploit, depending on the week. He'd also, years earlier, talked his way onto Ridgewood Center's charity board, purely for the photo ops. One more overlapping thread between the Hartley and Callaway worlds that I hadn't known existed until it was standing in front of me in a very expensive suit. He cornered me at a Hartley Industries shareholder dinner, because of course he did, because apparently no gathering of rich people in this world was complete without an ambush, with a photographer conveniently nearby and a smile that had never once reached his eyes. Julian Callaway, he said, savoring it. The suppressant scandal, the club altercations. Quite the resume for someone the Major's been so publicly devoted to. I do wonder what the board will think when they see just how far his judgment has slipped. Old Julian, apparently, had a genuinely impressive filthy vocabulary buried somewhere in muscle memory, because several excellent options presented themselves. I went with a different strategy instead. You're right, I said sweetly. It is quite the resume. Would you like the full list, or just the highlights? Because I've read your file too, Victor, and I have to say, embezzling from a children's outreach program you personally chaired for optics is so much worse than getting escorted out of a nightclub for being annoying. One of us made bad choices about vodka. The other one made bad choices about stealing from 7-year-olds. The color drained out of his face fast enough to be genuinely satisfying. I don't know what your Ridgewood Center's donor ledger has some interesting gaps around your tenure as board chair, I said, pleasant as anything. I volunteer there. I talk to people. People talk back. You'd be amazed what a bored, disgraced socialite picks up when nobody thinks he's paying attention. I took his own untouched champagne flute off the tray beside him and raised it in a mock toast. So here's my counteroffer. You leave William's judgment alone, and I leave your embezzlement alone. Or we can both go public tonight and see whose scandal photograph's worse. I genuinely don't care either way. I've had a very good week. I did not, in fact, have any hard evidence of anything. Old Julian's scattered memories had supplied me with rumor and gossip, not documents. But Victor Kane didn't know that, and the look on his face when he backed away, sputtering something about misunderstandings, was worth every second of the enormous bluff. William found me 2 minutes later, having watched the entire exchange from across the room with an expression somewhere between alarm and open admiration. You just threatened a board member with information you may or may not actually possess, he said. I have excellent poker face genetics, apparently. Julian. He was fighting a smile, and losing, badly. That was reckless. It was very reckless, I agreed. It was also extremely fun, and he deserved it, and no one got hurt, which honestly feels like the correct ratio for a Tuesday. You could have let me handle him. You could have let me handle him, I shot back. I don't need protecting, Major. I need someone to hold my champagne while I ruin a corrupt board member's night. There's a difference. Something in his face shifted then, soft, unguarded, in a way I hadn't seen from him yet, not even in the hallway. Noted, he said. I'll hold the champagne next time. My bluff, it turned out, had been more accurate than either of us realized. 2 weeks later, Hartley Industries' internal auditors, quietly and entirely without my involvement, I swear, turned up a genuinely impressive paper trail connecting Victor Kane to 3 years of inflated vendor invoices routed through the very outreach program he'd chaired for optics. William told me about it over breakfast, with the studied neutrality of a man trying very hard not to look smug and failing completely. The board's requesting his resignation this afternoon, he said, sliding the morning paper across the table like it was a peace offering. Quietly. No press. Quietly, I repeated, unimpressed. Victor Kane humiliated an entire room of donors by trying to smear a charity's biggest volunteer, and he gets to slink out the back with a severance package and his dignity intact? That's generally how these things are handled. That's boring, is what that is. I stole a piece of his toast, mostly on principle. He gave a keynote at the Ridgewood Spring Benefit last year, William. There is footage. There is a podium. Which is how, 3 days later, I ended up standing at the back of the very same auditorium where Victor Kane had once delivered an hour-long address on corporate ethics, watching the Ridgewood Center's annual volunteer appreciation slideshow play out exactly as scheduled. Except that somewhere between rehearsal and showtime, the AV team's usual highlight reel of smiling kids and finger-painted thank you cards had acquired one additional slide, sourced entirely from publicly available donor disclosure filings I had, very legally, spent an afternoon reading for fun. It was, I'll admit, the single most effort I had put into anything since arriving in this body, and I stood by every minute of it. A special thank you to our most generous donor, the slide read, over a photo of Victor Kane's own keynote from the year before. Wu's personal contribution to this year's budge was approximately 40%, less than his expense report suggested. It stayed up for exactly 11 seconds before someone in the booth cut to the next slide, but 11 seconds in a room full of Chicago's most gossip-hungry donors was more than enough. By the time we left, half the room was already texting, and Victor Kane, who had, mercifully, not been present to witness his own public math homework, would spend the following week fielding calls he clearly did not want to take. That was not, strictly speaking, legal. William said in the car afterward, fighting a smile so hard his jaw was practically vibrating with the effort. It was 100% legal. Everything on that slide was public record. I simply formatted it generously. I buckled my seatbelt, thoroughly pleased with myself. Nobody got hurt major. He just got humbled in front of a room full of people whose respect he clearly valued more than the children he was supposed to be helping. That's not a crime. That's karma with a PowerPoint template. Remind me, William said, pulling out of the lot, never to make an enemy of you. Too late for that advice, I said. You already like me. Much bigger tactical error if you think about it. A few nights later, once the dust from the auditorium had properly settled, and Victor Kane had become nothing more than a cautionary anecdote at Hartley board meetings, William found me at Ridgewood after closing hours, sitting on the front steps with my jacket collar turned up against the wind, waiting for a car I'd sent away 20 minutes earlier, for no better reason than that I hadn't wanted the evening to end yet. He didn't ask why I was still there. He just sat down beside me on the cold concrete steps like it was the most natural place in the world for a decorated war hero to spend his evening, close enough now that there was no careful 2-foot buffer left to measure, no countdown, no performance in either direction. Can I ask you something? I said, watching my breath fog under the streetlight. Why me? You've had 3 years of very available, very appropriate options. I am, by every metric that exists, a disaster. William was quiet for a moment, long enough that I thought maybe I'd finally found the one topic that could rattle him. Because you apologized to the valet for making him wait at a party where you were the guest of honor, he said finally. Because you gave a 7-year-old 3 free wins before you started actually trying. Because you built a bluff out of nothing but sheer nerve to protect a man you'd known less than 2 months, and you didn't think twice about the risk to yourself. He looked at me, steady, unhurried, the same way he had in that first hallway. I've spent 3 years watching people perform for cameras, Julian. You're the first person I've met in a long time who wasn't performing at all. I have genuinely terrible tabloid coverage, I said, because apparently my coping mechanism for feelings was still deflection, even in a new body. I don't read headlines, he reminded me. I told you that already. You did. I meant it. The space between us had gone from 2 feet to considerably less without either of us appearing to move, and I was abruptly, acutely aware of how good he smelled up close. Cedar and gun oil and something warmer underneath, something that made every instinct in this new Omega body sit up and take extremely enthusiastic notes. William, I said, and it came out rougher than I meant it to. Julian. His hand came up, slow, giving me every opportunity to step back and rested against my jaw, warm and careful, like I was something he'd been given permission to touch and still couldn't quite believe. I've been waiting since that hallway to do this. Stop me if I've misread it. You have not misread it, I said, and closed the last of the distance myself. Kissing him felt like finally beating a boss fight. I hadn't realized I'd been grinding toward my entire second life. The relief of it, the sheer rightness, his hand sliding careful and steady into my hair like he had all the time in the world and intended to use every second of it. Somewhere in the part of my brain that never entirely shut off, a single triumphant thought surfaced. Achievement unlocked. I did not for once say that out loud. There was time. Telling my family took considerably less courage than I'd braced for, mostly because it turned out they'd all already figured it out weeks before I had. We know, Diane said, when I finally sat them down, looking suspiciously close to tears. Julian, sweetheart, the entire household staff has a betting pool. Alfred started it. I believe David currently owes Charlotte $40. You had a pool? You two have been orbiting each other at every family event for 2 months now, David said, entirely unrepentant. It wasn't exactly subtle. Even Robert, when I braced myself and told him directly, the man who, in the version of this story I'd been dreading, disowned me on live television for less, just studied me for a long moment across his desk, gray eyes doing that appraising thing they always did, before he cleared his throat, gruff and visibly uncomfortable. Like sincerity was a language he was only just starting to practice out loud. William Hartley has asked my permission for a formal courtship 3 separate times over the past 2 weeks, he said finally. I finally told him he didn't need it. You're 24, not property, and frankly, son, the word caught, awkward and unpracticed, like it still didn't quite fit right in his mouth, but he pushed through it anyway. You've been happier this month than I've seen you in 6 years. I'm not going to be the reason that stops. I did not cry in front of my terrifying real estate mogul father. I want that on the record. It was a very close thing, but I did not cry. The courtship, once it was official, announced publicly at a Hartley Industries gala that Victor Kane conspicuously did not attend, having quietly resigned from the board for personal reasons, that I strongly suspected involved a very thorough internal audit, was, against every prediction the tabloids had ever made about the Calloway family's problem son, disgustingly sweet. William courted like a man who had spent 3 years being denied the chance to be soft with anyone, and had decided to make up for lost time all at once. He learned my guild's raid schedule, and started blocking out those exact evenings on his own calendar so he'd never accidentally interrupt one. He showed up at Ridgewood with a scaled-down chess set for Marcus, and somehow ended up teaching an entire rec room full of kids to play, with the terrifying, focused patience of a man who once held a mountain pass against impossible odds and now applied the exact same discipline to explaining the knight's move to a room of 7-year-olds. He never once made me feel like the villain the tabloids, or the version of this story that never happened, had decided I was supposed to be. One rainy Tuesday, 3 months into all of it, I made the catastrophic decision to hand William a controller. I don't understand this game, he said, 20 minutes later, staring at the screen with the exact focus intensity he probably used to read satellite terrain maps, while my on-screen character got flattened by a boss he had, at that point, died to 11 times in a row. The patterns aren't logical, they're extremely logical. You're just used to enemies who don't respawn. That seems like a design flaw. That's the genre, William. He died a 12th time. I laughed so hard I had to set my own controller down, and he turned to look at me, annoyed, competitive, and unmistakably, helplessly fond, all at the same time, with an expression I hadn't seen on the hero of Ridgeline Pass in any of the news coverage I'd read about him. Not the calm command voice face. Not the careful, guarded courtship face. Just a man losing badly at a video game and enjoying it anyway, because I was laughing next to him. Teach me the pattern, he said, resetting the fight with the grim determination of a man who had once held a mountain pass against worse odds than a pixelated dragon. By 1 in the morning, he'd beaten it. By 2, my entire guild had adopted him as an honorary member with the tag Colonel Sandbags, over his mild but genuine protest, and by the following week he'd quietly memorized the raid schedule of a game he'd never heard of a month earlier, purely so he could clear his own calendar around it without me having to ask. You didn't have to learn my guild's raid times, I told him, later, curled against his side on a couch that had somehow become the permanent location of most of our evenings. I wanted to know what mattered to you. He said it simply, like it wasn't a whole revelation, like men who'd spent 3 years being treated as a headline instead of a person just casually learned to care about other people's hobbies as a matter of course. You died playing this once. In your old life. I'd like to understand what you loved enough to lose sleep over before I lose you to it too. I didn't have a joke ready for that one either. I just kissed him, slow and unhurried, in the blue glow of a paused game screen, and thought, not for the first time, and not for the last, that whatever cosmic accounting error had landed my soul in this body, in this world, in this exact living room, I was in no hurry at all to file a complaint, none. There were nights, too, softer than the teasing and the wine table rescues and the guild raids. Nights where the space between careful and close finally closed all the way, where his hands were as deliberate and steady undressing me as they'd been that first night in the hallway, counting me down from panic instead of toward it. I won't pretend those nights don't belong to us alone. I'll only say that an alpha who spent 3 years learning to be gentle with a world that rarely deserved it turned out to know exactly how to be gentle with me too, and that some mornings I woke up in his bed still faintly, contentedly disbelieving that I'd gotten a second life good enough to include this. 6 months after the gala, where I'd nearly hyperventilated my way into a scandal, he got down on one knee in the Ridgewood rec room. Not at a black tie event, not with photographers, just Marcus and a dozen other kids from the program shrieking in the background as they figured out what was happening, and asked me to bond with him properly, Alpha and Omega, permanent real. You could have picked somewhere fancier, I said, laughing and crying in roughly equal, undignified measure. I picked somewhere that mattered, William said, steady as ever, ring in hand, looking at me like I'd hung the moon and several nearby stars. You showed me who you actually were in a hallway at a gala I almost skipped. I wanted to ask you here, where you first started showing everyone else too. I said yes before he'd even finished the sentence properly. Marcus, delighted beyond all reason, informed the entire rec room at top volume that Major Hartley was going to have a boyfriend forever, which was, frankly, a more accurate summary of the entire relationship than anything the tabloids ever managed. The wedding itself was smaller than anyone in Chicago society expected, and louder than anyone in the Calloway family had planned on, mostly because Robert, who had spent 3 years perfecting the art of icy disapproval, turned out to have exactly one soft spot in his entire body, and it was watching his youngest son get married in the backyard of the house he'd once threatened to disown him from. Julian Calloway, the disgraced Omega heir who was supposed to die alone and unloved in a story that never got the chance to happen here, married the hero of Ridgeline Pass on a bright October afternoon under a tent strung with more lights than the block probably had circuits for, with his whole loud, complicated, thoroughly won-over family in the front row, and a butler named Alfred who cried more than anyone and denied it fiercely afterward, claiming, with a perfectly straight face, that it was seasonal allergies in October. David gave a toast that started as roasting material and ended, unexpectedly, with him having to stop twice to collect himself. Charlotte cried through her own reading and blamed it on the lighting for her skin. Diane didn't even bother pretending. She simply sat in the front row holding tissues in both hands, beaming the entire ceremony, occasionally elbowing Robert every time his composure threatened to crack, which was often. Sophie Larkspur, seated with her actual girlfriend from law school, caught my eye at one point during the vows and mouthed, unmistakably, "I told you so," which was, I decided, the single most accurate wedding toast anyone gave that day, even though she never took the microphone. I stood at the front of that tent in a suit that fit, for once, on purpose, watching William walk toward me looking like every ridiculous, over-the-top description of him the tabloids had ever printed, and none of them at the same time. Steady, sure, and looking at me like I was the only fixed point in a room full of moving parts, and thought, with the same clear, stupid clarity I'd had right before my heart gave out over a video game. This is the good ending. I actually got the good ending. We exchanged the bond bite that night, quiet and private, away from the reception noise, his mouth warm and careful at the curve of my neck, exactly where the old memory fragments of Julian's canon fate had once promised a very different kind of scar. Instead, there was this steady hands, A low murmured, "I've got you against my skin," and a mark that didn't mean ruined. It meant chosen. "For the record," I said, once I'd caught my breath, "if this bite gives me some kind of tragic hero adjacent glow-up, I will be extremely annoyed. I like my face." "Your face is unaffected," William said, deadpan, already reaching to fix the collar I'd rumpled. "You do, however, currently smell like you belong to me, which several of my board members are going to find very confusing come Monday." "Good," I said. "Let them be confused. It's character building. I did not, for the record, cry in front of my entire extended family and a wedding photographer. I want that formally noted for the archive. It was, once again, an extremely close thing. I never did find out what junior year of high school had broken in the boy whose body I now called my own. But somewhere between the hallway and the altar, I stopped needing to know. Some stories don't need the tragic backstory. Some of them just need someone willing to stay long enough to write a better one. And, apparently, someone willing to threaten a corrupt board member on his behalf in the meantime. Epilogue. 6 months later. "You're doing the face," William said, not looking up from the report he was reading at the kitchen island. 6 months and 1 wedding band into a marriage that had, against literally every prediction anyone had ever made about either of us, turned out to be the single easiest thing in either of my lives. "What face?" "The one where you're about to ask me for something you already know I'm going to say yes to, and you're pretending it's a negotiation anyway." "I need the East Wing," I said. "For land night, my whole guild's flying in. We're finally taking down the Voidmaw remaster, and I refuse to do it on a laggy hotel connection like a peasant." William set down the report with the exact deliberate patience of a man who had once talked a hyperventilating stranger through a panic attack using nothing but a slow count to 4, and who now applied that same unshakable calm to the fact that his husband wanted to convert their formal dining room into a 12-person gaming tournament. "The East Wing has the good chandelier. The good chandelier will survive. I have faith in it." Julian. He was fighting a smile again, the one he still tried and failed to hide, 6 months in, like it embarrassed him a little how easy I made it. "You do remember I'm your ride to the airport for their arrival, since apparently none of your online friends know how to use a rideshare app. That's why I married a war hero and not a rideshare app. Efficiency. Is that the only reason?" Obviously not. I crossed the kitchen and kissed him, slow and unhurried, the way I'd gotten to do every single day since the rec room and the ring and the vows, and felt him smile against my mouth like it still, somehow, surprised him that he got to have this. "I also married you for your excellent taste in chandeliers you're about to sacrifice for my guild. I never agreed to sacrifice the chandelier." "You will," I said, entirely confident, "by Friday." He did, by the way. By Friday. Marcus came to watch, having been smuggled in with Diane's enthusiastic blessing and a promise of pizza, and sat on William's lap through the entire 12-hour raid, providing color commentary with the ruthless honesty only a 7-year-old can manage. My guild, who had spent 2 years of my previous life knowing me only as a username, got to watch, live, as the decorated Major William Hartley, hero of Ridgeline Pass, learned to say "pull the boss" with the exact same crisp, disciplined precision he'd once used to call in an extraction under fire, and cheered louder than anyone in the room when Voidmaw finally went down for the 2nd time in my 2 lives combined. Afterward, once the raid party had scattered home, and Marcus had fallen asleep sideways across William's lap somewhere around hour 10, still clutching a controller he'd long since stopped pressing buttons on, William carried him off to the guest room with the same unhurried steadiness he did everything with, and came back to find me slumped happily against the doorframe of our very slightly chandelier-damaged dining room, grinning at a screen full of victory text. "We got him," I said. 2 lives, and I finally got him on the first try this time. I noticed. He came to stand behind me, arms looping loosely around my shoulders, chin settling into the exact spot at the top of my head he always seemed to find without looking. "You were very loud about it. You were louder. Half my guild thinks you're a plant, by the way. Nobody believes a decorated war hero actually screamed, 'Pull the boss,' with that much genuine enthusiasm. I've called in artillery strikes with less enthusiasm than that fight required," William said, entirely serious, and I laughed until I had to lean back against him just to stay upright. Outside, Lake Michigan was doing its slow gray autumn thing against the windows. The same view I'd stared at that first panicked night at the gala, without any idea it would ever feel like this. Familiar instead of foreign, mine instead of borrowed. Somewhere down the hall, I was fairly sure Alfred had already started a second betting pool on how long it would take me to talk William into doing this again. I made a mental note to find out the odds. I liked my chances. I died playing a video game once, in a life that ended with nothing more dramatic than an empty apartment and a perfect KD ratio nobody was around to appreciate. I got a second chance instead. A ridiculous fortune I never asked for. A family that argued about buttered dishes and loved each other loudly. A best friend from a rec room who'd drawn our wedding in crayon and insisted it be framed in my office. And a husband who had once talked a stranger through a panic attack in a marble hallway and never, not once in all the months since, stopped watching the door until I walked through it. Turns out the villain doesn't have to die in a gutter after all. Sometimes he just has to log back in, take the second chance seriously, and stick around long enough to get a better ending than the one anybody wrote for him the first time. If you made it this far, thank you for sticking with Julian, William, and an unreasonable number of video game references. If you want more stories like this one, messy transmigrations, alphas who overthink everything, and villains who'd honestly rather be gaming, follow the channel so you don't miss the next one. See you in the next world.